on the podcast with Keeshon Washington. Keeshon, welcome back to Unfeigned Christianity.
Thanks for having me back.
It's I think we had an episode back in October, October, November, where you came on and primarily shared your testimony, talked about just being the family of God, being brothers and sisters in the church and caring for one another. This episode, we're focusing a little more in specifically on the issue of racism. And so we'll get into that in a little bit. But first, just wanted to acknowledge that you have had some fairly big things happen in the last few months. Not only are we all experiencing COVID right now, and you're a teacher, so you're facing the challenge of working with students virtually, but you also in January, I believe, Clayton Shank passed away, and it's been a kind of a father figure, mentor in your life.
Mm-hmm.
How's that been going for you?
Yeah, he passed Christmas Day.
Oh, okay.
Um, and yeah, our family actually moved in. We kind of quarantined as a staff before the stay-at-home order even happened in PA,
Oh, okay.
in hopes that we could be responsible and be ready to open up, March 30th or whatever, wherever it was.
Yeah.
Of course, we're long by that. We're long past that now. We know we're not going to be back now, and
Yeah.
so we had started a quarantine already with just the immediate group there as a group quarantine.
Yeah.
So our immediate group was our staff that lived locally, and those who didn't, we had to stay away from them. So I stayed for another week or two there, hung out with our staff, and then I finally just moved back home to Clayton's house,
Oh,
to
okay.
where my sisters and mom live right now,
Yeah.
and spent time there for about a week, and then I moved. I'm not supposed to move all this time, but really needed to get around some children because my spirits were starting to fall.
Hmm.
So I moved over here to my brother's house, which is where I'm at right now, my brother
Okay.
Kevin, and planning to head back home tomorrow, actually,
Oh, okay.
to
Okay.
the Shanks again.
Yeah.
But just being with them, listening to my nieces talk about granddaddy all the time, and
Mm-hmm.
um, Clayton left behind a legacy and a reputation of a man who really loved God,
Mm-hmm.
and that's not just to the public; that's to us as a family. And every once in a while, our family has a chat, and we put a tear emoji to indicate that we're thinking of him.
Hmm.
And sometimes we'll explain, sometimes we won't. Those have been increasing recently.
Hmm.
Just we miss him. We want to know what he would be doing during this time,
Yeah.
and realizing that that's going to be a lifetime
Yeah.
of longing for him but not having him.
Yeah.
And but we all love Jesus. We're all fulfilled by him,
Hmm.
and I think that really is enough. And we have each other yet on top of that. So we're blessed. We have more than we need. It's a matter of recognizing the help we really do have and not
Yeah.
becoming disillusioned and ungrateful. And so
Yeah.
I think most of us are in a pretty good place, but we struggle.
Yeah. Yeah. I can imagine. My mom was killed 4 days before our wedding, so I didn't really have life at home without her. Was newly married. How's that been? How many of you are at home yet? With
So there's Tanya. She's getting married this summer. Autumn
mm,
is home for good now. She's teaching at school next year. Wendy is going to Faith Builders, but they're all home right now.
okay.
And Hannah is still in school.
Yeah.
And then there's Mary Lois and
Yeah.
me.
Yeah. So
But I'm temporary. So
yeah. 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 I can definitely identify with the concept of grief being like waves where it comes. Sometimes it feels like the things, birthdays or special dates where you should feel extra emotional, you go through them and it's fine. And then there's random thoughts or random little experiences that just make you think of for me, for mom, think of mom, or wonder how she would respond to a certain situation, and it just floods in with grief like that. And
Yeah.
uh, think about you guys a
Yo,
lot.
appreciate it. One thing that I do is when I run across those painful moments. For example, Dad loved to cook, and he always talked about grilling. He never really did it. He was never really good at it, but so me grilling. But he was the type of guy that when we were at family cookouts, he loved to be the one that was grilling, and he was the one that people relied on for that.
Yeah.
And so whenever I see a grill, I think of him. And so what I did was I kind of thought, how do I take the power of this pain and make it a positive thing?
Hmm.
So I got into grilling,
Hmm.
and I got into that, and it was not only a way for me to honor him,
Hmm.
but also a way for me to um, no longer see that as a bad thing. Like, oh, he's not here to grill anymore,
Hmm.
but that I can do something that he used to do.
Yeah.
Um, I'm on a diet right now, so I can't eat Reese's peanut butter cups. But when I was buying candy, even though I don't like them, that's what I would buy because it's like I'm allowing him to continue to shape my life even beyond his earthly existence. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
that's one way that I feel um, we can honor those who we've lost is by taking things that are triggers for us and
Yeah.
making them part of our lives.
Yeah.
But also not feeling guilty if I'm not a griller and he was.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
we shouldn't let that hurt us and let it feel this have a false identity. But
Yeah.
that's one thing that's been helpful for me
Yeah.
is I've lost two dads now, and then so with
Hmm.
Clayton, he was a speaker.
Hmm.
He wrote poems. How can I do those things to honor him?
Hmm.
So
Hmm. What's one of your favorite memories of Clayton?
probably when he was there, I don't know if it's favorite. It gives the impression that it brings back great memories, but
Hmm.
he was the first one outside my family that came to the hospital when my biological dad passed away.
Hmm.
That was a really hard experience for me. And when he was there, I don't like hugs, and I think I tell people it was the first hug I ever actually wanted.
Hmm.
I
Wow.
hugged him, and I really, really wanted to be hugged because um, Clayton had become a dad to me, and
Hmm.
so I lost a dad and hugged my dad in the same,
Wow.
in the same hour, and it just I realized how blessed I was and how much he was there for me.
Yeah.
He since that he had preached a sermon about salvation, and he always seemed to give these little looks at me during the sermons to indicate that he knew what the pain that I was in. He'd preach about loss. He'd preach about, and so then getting to walk through that with him,
Hmm.
and see him dying and seeing him suffering,
Hmm.
realizing that. So I think the next hug that was meaningful for me was on his deathbed,
Hmm.
and I actually thanked him, and I retold that story to him how much that shaped me, and so that's become sort of a figurehead for what Clayton meant to me. Was he was always the one that was there when things broke down, and I think that's what family should be, and that's how it was in my urban culture.
Yeah.
But for some reason in mental culture, when things got bad, stop in, drop off a meal, and leave. It's not bad intentions, but it's almost like we'll give you space, we'll be praying for you.
Hmm.
Whereas in the culture that I came from, we're coming over there, we're going to help you solve this for better or worse, whether you want it or not. Clayton was always that for me. He was very invasive, very aggressive,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
that's something that I needed and wanted in my life.
Hmm.
And so
Wow.
he didn't ask to come over to the hospital, he came.
Yeah.
And if he got rejected, he'd understand. But
Yeah.
that I didn't
Just
have
showed up.
to tell him to come, he came.
Yeah.
And that's to me is the perfect story to explain who Clayton was.
Yeah.
Uh,
Wow.
he almost had an arrogance about him that he would just move without asking or thinking or
Hmm.
double overthinking things.
Yeah.
But I loved it. It was great for me.
Yeah. Wow. That's powerful. Yeah, I did not. did not really get to know Clayton personally. I think my dad would have known him a little better. He, I was there in York once for a weekend. I was at SMBI, Sherman Bible Institute, and their forget what they call them, outreach weekend or something, local church outreach or something. And went with a group to York, and then one time he and Mary Lois, is that his wife? Yeah.
Yeah.
They were out here for a weekend. But I got to know Kevin a little bit more, and then Curtis and Kelly would know them.
Mm-hmm.
But I've always admired from a distance just the way. So they're living there in York, and obviously York isn't a super big city, but it's very urban and not typical for many Mennonites in Pennsylvania, I guess. And yet their family seems very vibrant, very in love with Jesus, and I just admire anybody who can have more than 2 or 3 kids and raise them to have that vibrancy for Jesus as well. It's something I long to emulate as well.
Yeah, he really blessed us.
Yeah. What well, my mind just went blank on a transition from that into a topic of racism, but
Mm-hmm.
I guess we'll just go into racism here. We were talking a little bit before turning on the recording button here, just some of the it's easy for us as white people to either we tend to deny that racism exists, or we acknowledge that racism exists and we want to fix it or understand it, and then we look to our friends of color, whether it be black or brown, Hispanic, or Asian or whatever, and just start trying to have them explain racism to us. And often what can happen is we see what they're reading is racism, we see other explanations for it, and we end up not actually listening to them, but trying to justify their experience. Or maybe we do listen, and it can be easy to cling to 1 or 2 friends to try and claim that we have a diverse set of friends. Or how can, just to let you share some of what we were sharing before we turned on the mics, what is your perspective on that, and how can we as white people, you mentioned how racism is our responsibility, it's not yours, like it's not, and I thought that was important for us to remember in this conversation, that we learn what it feels like, we learn to see things that we're blind to by listening to our friends of color, but it's really not their issue to solve for us. We as white people have done racist things, and we'll get into this in a little bit, but obviously anybody can be racist, but the dominant culture in America or in the West, really throughout history, has been the European white man has the power, has the widest sphere of influence to exhort his racism, and that has happened here in America. And so it's our responsibility. It's not our friends of color's responsibility. How should, as we talk about racism, as we learn, what are just some things on the onset of this conversation to tell your white brothers and sisters?
Sure. So one of the things that I want to clarify there with it's your responsibility. I think it's in general, it's the kingdom's responsibility, and that of course involves every color. You think about when John saw into heaven, and he saw all tribes, all languages. How did he know there were multiple tribes? How could he tell? Was it what they were wearing? Probably not. I don't think that would matter. It seems like there was clearly different colors, clearly different, visibly different cultures. The kingdom is diverse. And that means that if the kingdom has to solve the problem, then that means that several colors are involved there. It's just that, like you said, historically, there is a disproportionate amount of oppression and power, a rough history there that needs to be acknowledged. And I think that's where the idea of there are people of color who don't like having to explain this to people because it feels like a good heart would already know. It's hard to justify with the scriptures that we have and the resources that we have, such as Google, that we're so unknowledgeable. And especially the scriptures, though. And Paul and Jesus were so emphatic about the multi-ethnic church going forward, post Jesus, that for us not to understand or see the importance of that is really daunting, and, like I've said, a stain on our reputation. And so when people of color like me see that, and especially through writing the series I'm working on right now, it becomes fatiguing, and you start to wonder, is this even worth it? And first thing that happened when I posted my first article is a black friend of mine who I've talked with before said, you're wasting your time. There's no point. And I think more of the heart behind his thoughts there is, first off, it's not your responsibility to cover this. If people would read their Bibles and read the news, they would already have good opinions about this. And I just thought that was a little too simplistic. I thought that it meant that these perspectives would not get shared. And I didn't want that to happen. I wanted there to be if people want to know, if people want to see, I'm willing to volunteer and share. Me, Keeshon. But I understand when people don't want to, because one, the responses can be very ignorant, very, very close-minded. You can sit there and air out your feelings for hours, and then they respond with something that, as if they didn't hear anything you said, and it seems to me like a lot of people of color have just given up, said there's not really any hope. And I agree. I don't think there's really a way to blame them. I think that there is a clear need here now, since there is so much hostility, there is so much tension, there are so many walls, that we go to biblical instruction, we go to the Holy Spirit for power, and we use what we know as humans to socially become tactful and respectful. And we use all of those things to humble ourselves and become more loving, so we're able to address this problem from a kingdom perspective. And so even all my friends know, when I have heart-to-hearts with them about racism, especially my friends of color, they know that I'm not neutral when it comes to Christianity versus not Christianity. That's not going to change. And they know that, and that's at the forefront, because that's all I talk about when we talk about racism. I said, yeah, man, it's really messed up, because the Bible speaks against this stuff. The Bible talks about how the church should be unifying, especially in Romans. And the fact that white American churches, and even, just the churches in general, being all their own race, all their own culture, is really not a depiction of what it was supposed to look like. And even they can get behind, even my atheist friends can get behind that and say, so you do get it. You just get it a different way. And it not only promotes Jesus as a complete following Jesus as a complete worldview that doesn't have these gaping gaps that makes us all idiots, but applying Jesus to this issue points them to the place where they need to be in to begin with. And it's white people and black people alike are not going to solve this issue themselves. It's going to take Jesus, who is God,
Yeah.
to unify the church as directed in Romans. And um, one thing that I just wrote about in Article 3 is how Jesus was at Nazareth in his hometown. And he came and said, I am the Messiah. You read from Isaiah. And they're like, yes, the Messiah from our hometown. And they're like excited, like, yes, praise you, the Messiah. And then he's like, gave two examples, named started with the Z and then Naaman, and says that basically that the kingdom is for everyone, not just for the people here.
Mm.
And then they want to kill him. And they're like, oh, what's wrong with you? And it's very easy for the for monoethnic cultures to say, well, that doesn't really describe us. We're not trying to kill people for
Mm.
telling us to diversify. But have we responded in less extreme ways, such as discrediting, gaslighting, straw manning, whatever it is,
Mm.
discrediting the issue, and not looking at it from a biblical perspective in order to curb our own guilt or not take any responsibility?
Yeah.
And I think that the church is responsible. I think the church is responsible to address this issue. And
Mm.
so the mere fact that we are Christians indicates that we need to be a part of this solution
Mm.
and part of addressing this.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, I'll stop there because I'll talk for an hour and then answer all your questions before you ask them. But certainly, I understand why people of color are tired of explaining, and I think that we need to give what's the right word, allow that to be the case and
Mm.
not grow discouraged or too discouraged because we can't ever have anybody tell us how we feel.
Yeah.
That's one reason why I'm sharing, because
Mm.
I know a lot of friends that have tried to get their black friends to talk, and the painful experiences have bred distrust.
Yeah.
And so, um, as someone who would like to help others in my situation of color, especially Mennonite churches, if I can share, if I can speak on their behalf, not all of their behalf, because not all of them feel the same way,
Mm-hmm.
but the ones who do,
Mm-hmm.
maybe it will spare them and future people,
Mm.
maybe the next generation, maybe it'll spare them the pain and some of the pain and some of the hurtful comments that they would be getting.
Yeah. Yeah. I find myself in a bit of a tricky spot. I'm curious what your response would be. That, um, I mean, first of all, I really appreciate you being willing to talk about this issue, because there is a lot that a lot of us need to be enlightened in, or just don't see. And yet, and I also think I really appreciate talking with you, because I haven't met you personally yet, but we've spoken over Skype now a couple times and had some interaction via social media and so forth. You seem like one of the most disarming guys to have a conversation with on racism with, and I don't know anybody who sits down with Keeshon is gonna come away not only understanding the issue of racism better, but understanding Jesus and the scope of his love and his inclusion for everyone, despite, like, even outside of race, but different backgrounds and personalities and stuff. I've just, in our brief interactions together, I have sensed that from you and really appreciate that. And I think, just to set the stage for the audience and so forth who may not know you, this is not Keeshon's not someone who's disgruntled and just has a bone to pick and wanting to share, but it's born out of a love. I feel like a love for our church. Like, you wouldn't have to share this. You could go and find a more diverse branch of the Christian church, but the fact that you're entering this territory speaks love. And the thing that I struggle with is, So I have my own series. I haven't written it yet, but it's outlined what I would go over on racism and more kind of tracing a theological standpoint why this matters. Like you can trace all throughout the Old Testament into Jesus, that loving the immigrant and sharing, essentially sharing the gospel and Jesus with all tribes and all nations is a core central theme to all of Scripture. But we seem to have lost it in, I don't know if it's, I'm just reading through some of the history of the fundamentalist movement and so forth. I think some of that has maybe played into, as far as American, more recent, what's the word, blindness to social issues and so forth. But obviously, racism has existed for the whole history of humanity. But one of the things that I wrestle with in thinking of posting a series on racism is that I'm white. My audience is, I don't have the specific statistics, but my audience is primarily white, I'm assuming. I'm conservative Anabaptist. The conservative Anabaptist church is primarily white, 95% white. I don't know. I don't know the statistics there either. And when I look around on Facebook and other social media, people, whenever there are conversations about racism, you primarily are seeing and hearing white people talk to other white people, and it becomes this, we're not experiencing it firsthand, so it's kind of a theoretical bantering back and forth, trying to help others see. And I think it was a little over a year ago that I just started, well, in listening to some other authors and podcasters talk about this, I started realizing, we need to just kind of be quiet. Actually, to be honest, I think it was Dorcas Schmucker who wrote, maybe a couple years ago, wrote a series referencing the idea that we who are not black should maybe be quiet about what blacks are experiencing and just listening more. And so I've wanted to spend more time and energy listening to people of color, letting them share their stories, giving voice to their stories. My aunt, I have an aunt who's black, and so my cousins are biracial, and hearing their stories as I can. We don't live close by, so it happens long distance as well. But rather than just kind of us whites dominating the conversation again, but then how does that play into this feeling like blacks aren't required to share with us? And even the concept of a token friend who's, oh, I've got my one friend, and I listen to him, and so I've got a diverse set of friends. Is there value in writing a series on racism if I'm white? Is there value in having conversations on racism? Do you understand that question? Like, where does
Yeah.
that? Yeah.
Yeah. So it is a bit of a dilemma, isn't it? Because, and this is where people usually fatigue, and you'll see this in social media. You can never get it right. I only got actually one email specifically stating this, but there were several more that were hinting at it in the first series of responses or whatever. And one person said, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. You might as well just give up and let the world be broken. And I'm like, man, this does not sound very Christian. This does not, and I don't think we usually take this approach when it comes to things like other social or sinful practices like abortion or, what else do Christians speak up against? Gay marriage. But then we think of the concept of someone not being appreciated based off of their differences, and we just kind of say, well, you might as well just quit, or you might as well not address it because you're just going to end up getting hurt. And I'm like, that doesn't smell of the sacrificial love that we've been preaching over our pulpits for years. And I think it's imperative that we address this dilemma with a dilemma killer, which is Christ. You know, whenever in class and school, I'm a social studies teacher, and it always seems that we can never quite solve the dilemmas until someone brings up Jesus and gives an example from Matthew or Luke. Really explains and shows how this is, we don't practically or in a scientific way or have we can't deduct how to solve this issue with logic, but here is our example. Here's what he did, and here's how we can address this. And when we see reactions that are not Christ-like, we know that's a red flag. We know that's a problem. And so, and again, I wrote about this and I will say it bluntly, when people of color don't respond in a Christ-like way, when the people who have been hurt don't respond with a heart of forgiveness. One of the things that I praise God for is I believe, or I should know, and I do know, that God has helped me to forgive every racist person in my life ever. Doesn't mean that if I see them, I won't have a reaction like, oh boy, like I remember what happened last time I talked to this person. But anybody who would have hinted racism toward me in my past has been forgiven completely. And when I say that, I literally don't have hatred in my heart for them. It's not just a platitude or something I just say to make myself believe it or pretend to love them. I really do love them. And I wish that every person of color, every white person, every Mennonite, non-Mennonite, whatever in the world could experience that freedom. But I also remember what it was like to live bitterly and in frustration. And because of different worldviews, because of all these different things, going back to your question, should you write an article about racism because you're not speaking from a position of experience personally? I think there's a way that you can do that that's tactful. I think that you can do that in a way that promotes the voices of people who are speaking from experience. I guess I wouldn't have to, but I have in the series referenced some friends. I quoted a friend who said that he thinks that Mennonites will be surprised to find Black people in heaven, even though John already said that there would be. They're gonna walk around heaven, which in itself is a kind of a compliment. He's admitting that they're going to be in glory. He's admitting they're Christians. He just thinks that they're a little blind to their ignorances, and they'll be surprised and perhaps even on the judgment seat, or however you view that, have to repent of ethnocentrism because they don't see these. They don't see the people, their neighbors, people around them, as the image of God. They see them as these thugs or these criminals or these offended third generation slaves who never experienced slavery personally and just want reparations and want to be catered to. And they see all of that, but fail to see the one thing that is always true, which is they are the image bearers of Christ. They are our neighbors. We are to love them. And so if you can write an article that promotes that love, promotes that response, that tells the stories of your aunt and your cousins, that seeks out to uses the experience from interviews like this, and especially others, not just me, even those who take a more aggressive stance than me, because I'm very, very Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. Not everybody likes that. Some people think it's too. It's like it's just a flowery response, and I'm like, I don't think that's ever a flowery response. I think that really is the answer. That's foundational to my faith. But I have some close Black friends, even Mennonite Black friends, as few as they are, that take an even more aggressive stance.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's some who take a less aggressive stance and don't even think they've ever experienced racism in Mennonite churches. All of them would admit that they know it exists, but in their particular area would say they have never experienced it. And maybe just my social media presence and the fact that I travel is what has exposed me to bad actors. Hearing from them, gathering all those perspectives, giving some of your own. I think it's very okay and permissible for people who are white to chime in, as long as it's very clear. And one thing I've always cared about during the series I've been writing, I've asked my brothers, do you see a spirit of humility here? Is it evident? And don't be partial. Tell me how it really is. You can hurt my feelings if you need to. So far, every time that I've sent my articles to Kevin, he said, it sounds graceful. It sounds humble. It sounds like you're not attacking people. Go for it. And then I pray more about it, and I go and I send it to other people. I'm like, does this article scream humility to you, or is it too aggressive? I had to cut parts out because I want people to see my perspective as one that is as Christ-like as possible. And I think that's what you would have to do as well. Is anyone who reads that article leaves saying, this is a humble and a scripturally sound, well-researched response that points to Christ and points to people of color of having a voice that should be heard. That's one of my sub reasons for doing this series is I want people of color in Mennonite churches that are there now and the ones in the coming generation that will be there in the future to be heard, to be listened to, so that their gifts and what they have to bring can be added to the church in a way that it hasn't been in the Mennonite church, right? I mean, so that's my perspective on those things.
Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah, I've thought if I ever wrote something on that, I would probably send it at least to some different friends of color of mine just to get feedback on it. But yeah, I guess we'll see if we ever get there. I think, and maybe this will just kind of segue into one of the first questions that I had sent to you. But one of the values that I think we as fellow white people could bring is just an awareness to why the conversation on racism matters. And I guess because a lot of people, so I've written, I'm trying to think if I've written maybe a couple articles. I interviewed my aunt a couple years ago, or a year ago. But I've done some like Facebook statuses and stuff, kind of speaking to it a little bit, sharing quotes or something, having other people speak in. And a lot of times, like that alone gives enough feedback to know that not only do I wince for any friend of color of mine, but then just knowing that if I ever delved in more, it's probably going to be something that's controversial. But there seems to be a lot of, and you alluded to it a little bit before too, just to a certain degree, there is a, what's the word, animosity or just hostility against the suggestion that racism exists in conservative Mennonite churches. But in many ways, it also just kind of seems like a complete blindness too, and just not aware of it. And so, like, I look at that, and then I also look at friends of mine, and even just seeing. So we have here in LA, we don't work with too many black people, but a lot of Spanish people and Hispanics from Mexico, Guatemala, down other countries in Central America. And and even just watching us interact sometimes and realizing, you know what, we're kind of doing things the white way. And sometimes we need people to one example recently was the Super Bowl halftime show. Like I looked at that and have pretty much decided not to ever watch football again because it looks so demonic and resembling things that the Israelites were doing with pagan nations and so forth. But then some of our Hispanic friends are like, well, they actually thought it did a really good job of demonstrating Hispanic culture, and so it's like stuff like that. We have a hard time seeing through. We see the provocative, like yes, horrible immodesty, a lot of immorality woven in through that. But then we miss the cultural dynamics that are valid, legitimate as well. I'm getting a knock on my door. I might just quickly run and see what they need.
Mm-hmm. It's fine.
My son's done with school, so I told him we'd go to the park this afternoon if he gets done. Where was I? Oh, seeing. Oh, yeah. And so I guess I'm just saying all that to say when we see racism existing, or even just, we'll get into this in a little bit too, defining racism. But when we see the inability to see another person's perspective happening in our churches, we as fellow white people can maybe offer a perspective of why it matters to have these conversations and so forth. I'm just curious from your perspective, like why does racism matter? Obviously, we've alluded to it several times. Just for the audience, Keeshon is in the middle of writing a series called "What the Mennonites Have Gotten Wrong About Racism." Is that the title of it?
Yeah, basically.
Yeah. And so some of this, if you go and read his series, he touches on as well, goes more in depth, and obviously addresses more than what we'll get to in this podcast. But what, from your perspective, why does conversations about racism matter? And kind of dovetailing to that question, I have had some interaction with people who say they've grown up with black friends and they've never considered them anything different than a white person. And then I'll ask them, like, have you talked to them? Have you asked them how they feel? And they feel that to do that would be racist. And so they're not going to talk about this with their black friends because it would be racist. And what's your response to that? Why does it matter to have these conversations?
Yeah, so let's address first the question of why does conversations on race matter. I was actually going to name the series "What's Wrong with the Race Conversation in Our Churches," but I wanted to identify my audience in my title. Mm-hmm. So, but the reason that this matters is because, one, it's a sin. It's sinful to say that someone created in God's image is inferior to another person created in God's image. That is blasphemy. That's heresy. Mm-hmm. So that's not something that we want to be charged with. Mm-hmm. So it's so detestable, so distasteful that the go-to response is to snap back by saying, well, that's not who I am. I'm not racist. And the okay, that's very nice that you're not racist. So what would it mean for me to tell you that there is a massive amount of people in the world who are? Some people will say that that's not true, that it's not really an issue in America. I think that just points to a lack of knowing what's really happening around us. We get lots of platitudes at that point about, we're all one race, the human race. And some of these things are true. I don't see color, stuff like that. And I think that response in itself is an indication that these conversations matter, because I grew up in the hood at a school where I had there were about three white people in our graduating class in a freshman year. I was only at York High freshman, sophomore year. I graduated at our school and here at a church that I teach at now. But I would have graduated in a class of about 3 to 4, maybe 5 white people out of 100, maybe. So it's got to be more than that, but that's about how many. I've heard their voices. I communicate with some of them on a weekly basis. They don't feel the way that these white Christians do. That's just not the message that they send. And I'm like, shouldn't we be believing the people who have the skin color, have the culture, have the experience? Shouldn't we be listening to them? And like you said, not just white on white conversation, trying to solve the world, trying to solve the problems. It's kind of insulting to tell a black person that their experience is not valid, it's not complete. And the giving off that impression, which is often what happens, is what makes them want to just shut up and not say anything else to Mennonites. I've got friends that have left the Mennonite church and will not come back because they feel like Mennonites don't listen. And the same thing, they don't feel like they can trust Americans because they feel like that's what they experience outside of it too. That the white Republican, I want to be careful how much I categorize because I can be called guilty of the same things that I talk against, but the general crowd, you can fill in what that looks like yourself. They don't listen. They're too preachy. That's a problem because we have not seen people convert to Christ that way. We have not seen people convert to Christ through shouting in their ears that their opinion is invalid, and they have nothing to bring to the table. The truth is, when the Gentiles were becoming Christians, when they were being enticed to follow God, and I talked a little earlier about how in Nazareth they wanted to kill Jesus for even saying, just reading from Isaiah. I mean, you can't even read the scriptures without people getting upset. Jesus was sticking his neck out and putting his life on the line to speak very, very seriously that this gospel, this kingdom was for everybody. If we are not putting our necks out that way, then we're missing the point. We're missing something. We're missing a character of Christ that we should be emulating. And so being an ally looks like that, looks like what Jesus did there at Nazareth, where I wouldn't say he stood up for the Gentiles, but he made very clear that the gospel going forward was in the kingdom is going to involve both of them. And that's why Paul in Romans was like, okay, you Gentiles, you Jews, this is how you get along. This is how you do this. And that's the whole point of Romans, is leading up to this part where this is how you unify. This is how the church should look. And it wasn't saying things like you're not different. He acknowledged they were different. Some of them wouldn't eat certain meat. Some of them would. And so Paul addressed those things head on. And so our attitude of spitting it out of our mouth because it doesn't taste good is an indication of something that is not in the character of Christ. It's bad. It's not good. When we go there, we're not even following Christ's example. We're not even following the example of Paul and God's followers that are in the scriptures. We need to be aligning with that. The race conversation matters because it mattered to Paul. It mattered to Jesus. And why should it not matter to us? What makes us think that we, as those not written about in the holy inspired word, are supposed to be exempt from this because
Huh.
some people make us feel bad, but because we're white. I,
Mm.
I really don't like that response because it reminds me so little of Jesus
Mm.
and so much of those Jews at Nazareth
Mhm.
who wanted to throw Jesus off a cliff.
Mhm.
And the more we look like that, the less anyone's going to want to talk or hear from us, including about our Lord.
Yeah.
It's a
Yeah.
stain, and stains don't look good. I got a stain on my shirt down here. You can't see it, thankfully, but I hope you can't see it.
No, I can't.
Um, Good. Stains don't look good. They make the whole thing look bad. And this shirt is a good shirt,
Yeah.
but there's one stain that makes it look bad. I can't wear it in public. I do anyway because I'm lazy. But that's that's the problem with these stains.
Yeah.
Is there are people of color who are not receiving the word of God, who are not accepting Christ, who are not listening to followers of God
Yeah.
because are not they're not seeing love. They're not seeing a a heart that really seeks out to,
Hmm.
hey,
Hmm.
not only are you made in God's image, but you have gifts that can be used for the kingdom. That's something that I include in my discipleship all the time
Hmm.
with my students is I tell them, if you accept Christ, you're not just killing off everything that is you. You are dying, but you're also going to bring to the church every gift that you have. And that is a beautiful thing.
Mhm.
And that is why this conversation matters, because it it's directly connected to the acceptance of the world that is supposed to be one of those tribes that are not able to commune well with our culture, and that
Hmm.
should really bother us. Now, people say it's racist to Ash, are you with me?
I can hear you. Your picture froze. I'm not sure. It's probably my end a little bit,
It's
but
like you froze.
I can still hear you. Can you hear me? Hey, Keyshawn, can you hear me?
I
You're
was
up.
like, man, that transitioned really well, and then it just.
Yeah.
So I guess I'll just pick up on from there.
Yeah, just pick up from there. We're good to go.
Okay. So then on to people who would say it'd be racist for me to even go and ask them for their experience. Um, I don't. That one really perplexes me. I feel like that one is really a demonstration of a lack of knowledge or a lack of real world experience when it comes to interacting with people of color.
Hmm.
One thing we have to realize is color is mostly just color at a biological level. So it's true that I am more susceptible to diabetes because of my race. That's all true, and so that should not be discredited. That there is diversity among man, and that it's not just the way we look.
Hmm.
But if you take a person, a black guy, for instance, and he's adopted as a newborn into a Mennonite culture, and I know a few of these, um, grows up with all the same stigmas, all the same beliefs, practices, customs, he will likely, um, at some point, he'll have to reconcile with his skin color. But not all parents actually lead out in that very well,
Hmm.
um, and so he's going to have a different perspective than someone like me does. And so, one thing I've not appreciated is when those people are used, um, like you said, as token black friends.
Hmm.
They're kind of used as a defense mechanism to say, "Well, my one black friend doesn't even like black people." I've heard this said to me before. Like he doesn't even like his own people,
Yeah.
and I'm like, "Well, then he has problems too."
Eh.
that's one reason why we'll talk about this later. But definition of racism to me needs to withhold certain things that are
Hmm.
always true, because that's racist for a
Hmm.
black man to say I hate the black people of America is wrong. It's really
Hmm.
messed up, and it comes out of living in a culture that has taught him that the people who look like him
Mm-hmm.
are wrong or different.
Mm-hmm.
It reminds me of I wrote about this in the last article, I think. I don't know if I got rid of it or not, but I was at a banquet, um, and this man got up. He had
Yeah.
actually made the meal, and he said, "I have adopted two black boys, and they have been really giving me trouble. And but God bless their hearts. They're genetically not as fit to follow instructions, and they just need more time to get around." And he looked at me and said, "But not you, black boy, not you." And to me,
Wow.
if I would have confronted him, which I didn't because I
Mm-hmm.
was in a position of I needed to maintain my cool, um, I I feel like he would have responded by saying, "Well, my experiences back this up. From what I see,
Yeah.
this is how it is. I don't want to hurt anyone. It's just how it is. It is what it is."
Mm-hmm.
Um, he hasn't heard the majority of black people in America. He hasn't even really heard his own children because I knew his children.
Mm-hmm.
I had talked to one of his kids about being of color.
Mm-hmm.
Um, he had talked to me about wanting to know more, but not having any way of getting it. And I just, my point being, unless we really, really desire to know, we won't know. We'll live in ignorance as long as we're willing to do it
Yeah.
to shield our own ignorances and to hold our own agendas.
Yeah.
And one thing I tried to do is to listen to people who sound racist, even though they sound racist, so that I can learn, and maybe there's something there that I'm not seeing and missing. And
Huh.
just because someone arrogantly, I think I've written about this before, taking all criticism and making it constructive is something that I think is a high quality of a Christian, something that we
Mm-hmm.
should all consider and
Mm-hmm.
make a real part of our lives. That even though there may be flaws in their theology, we can learn, we can gain from this, and we can also give.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's not present in someone who says, "I don't even seek out to know and understand people of color," because that's racist in itself.
Yeah.
Not only is it cynical, but it's often used as a way to mock liberals
Yeah.
because you can never please liberals, right? That's just so unchristlike. It's so I cannot imagine that Jesus would look fondly on that. And
Yeah.
we really, really have to be very careful the attitude at which we approach this issue, even if we don't think it's an issue.
Yeah.
Are we humble enough to, which a lot of people, are we humble enough to to listen as if it were
Yeah.
and learn
Yeah.
and and hear and empathize?
Yeah.
If at the end of all that you don't agree, you don't see it, well then you listened and you heard and you continue to listen and learn. Maybe your mindset
Yeah.
will change in the future. But just saying I know one black person who never experienced this, or even like what you're saying, I don't want to ask them how they feel because that's offensive.
Mm-hmm.
Is offensive. That's
Yeah.
that's what's messed up about the conversation is that
Yeah.
um, we're not humble enough to seek after the wisdom that is there.
Yeah.
And I think that that's actually a massive disrespect to black culture, a slap in the face to say that for somehow one way or another I don't need to seek out to understand your culture
Mm-hmm.
is part of what's created the problem in the first place,
Yeah.
especially from a Christian ethic.
Yeah. So kind of, we keep dancing around the definition of racism, and we should get to that too. But another question that I had was, why why is it important to learn someone's taste or culture? And kind of, yeah, I've got a lot of responses or thoughts in my head as you were talking there, because like this really is, as most things, an extension of human life and human experience and our depravities in other ways. because like obviously if what's an example? If for someone who lost a loved one and somebody is walks up to them and just starts you're like, well, yeah, we know it's hard to lose loved ones, but we can hope in eternal life and Jesus is coming back and we'll be able to see them again and we can just move on with our life as it is. Most
Hmm.
people will be able to see and be like, whoa, dude, give him some space to grieve and sit in the sorrow and um, or if you're just joining a new job or a new church or something and you see all kinds of things that they're doing wrong, it's kind of protocol. We understand if you're new, you don't just jump in with your opinions and ideas. First, listen, understand what's been in the past, kind of what they've tried
Hmm.
or not done. And so that should play into conversations on racism or other issues that we and it kind of exposes that we have a preconceived idea about the conversation. We don't want to be confronted with the fact that it's maybe wrong or misshaped.
Yeah.
um, but yeah, like why does learning someone's taste or culture matter? Why does it? So I hear from, tell me if I'm wrong, but I hear from you saying that don't look at, oh, I don't see color, because seeing color is valuing the differences, and that's a part of what we see in scripture is that there's many different tribes and people coming together, working together. Um, so why with that, why does it matter that we understand culture and taste? So is it okay we enjoy black music when it's a cappella, um, kind of barbershop style black music or something that kind of mirrors a typical white culture or something? Is that the only kind of black music we should enjoy or listen to, kind of understand the black worldview? Or
Hmm. So I acknowledge that there are just difficulties about this that are there and that make this difficult. So it's not a solution to this problem, but it's a maybe some insights that might be helpful. Um, I think I'd mentioned even this earlier in this session here that part of what we need to be doing is seeking out the gifts of others,
mm,
identifying what do they bring to the table. And so people who are reading my articles acknowledge that me being a biracial Mennonite guy from the hood, um, with 10 years of membership in a Mennonite church, brings a perspective that's extremely rare.
mm-hmm,
That, um, in fact, of my friends of color, there's no one like me. There's no one that would fit those descriptions. Maybe one actually with a family, but then he's married and has kids and he's anyway.
mm,
So
mm-hmm,
I have a perspective that for a long time I wasn't sharing because of the reactions I would get
mm,
when it comes to racism. I was never afraid that what I had to say wasn't right. I was afraid that it would cause more division than it helped
mm,
um,
mm,
break away. Um, there are other people with perspectives that should be heard. It's not just Keeshon.
mm,
It's not just the people who Keeshon recommends. It's enemies.
mm,
It's atheists.
mm,
It's Black Baptists. It's Black Pentecostals, Hispanic Pentecostals. It's all of these people.
mm,
Um, Asians, Christian Asians. There's all these people need to be heard as well.
mm,
And seeking out their gifts, it sounds self-centered, but it does advantage us. It advantages the kingdom as a whole.
mm,
Not only does it help them to verbalize what they have to offer and maybe even validate them and enable them to share those gifts, um, But that is exactly what Paul was trying to get across to the church is, hey guys, look around. You've got preachers, you've got teachers, you've got administrators.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Let me go see what's up here.
yeah.
Okay.
So that's what Paul was trying to address with the church. He was saying, look around, guys. You've got teachers and preachers and administrators and gift givers and servers, and you've got all these different gifts among you. And the context seems to indicate that you would not have this broad amount of giftings if you weren't diverse. So that's still true today. It's not limited to just those gifts. There's all kinds of perspectives and talents that are out there that can be used. And you can't tell me that there aren't talents in Asian culture that can't be used for the kingdom that aren't worthwhile. You can't tell me there. I mean, Black culture is a very American, very observable closely by Americans. It's clouded by media and made to look negative. To call out all the negative aspects, and of course, white culture is there. Hispanic culture is very prominent. We see all these cultures. Do we see their value? And that's not all it should be. It should not just be, we want to convert this person and bring them into our church so we can use them. That's not, no, absolutely not. And I hope no one listening to this thinks that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is that's what Paul was saying. That's what the Bible tells us. And so it feels to me like, again, back to our responsibility as a church, we are all partially responsible to seek out the people who are different than us, people who are not being involved, not in the kingdom, and involve them to bring that about. If we're not doing that, it just becomes so hard for me to imagine how you can justify that, how you can find a worldview that includes passionate Christ-following belief and love that does not include wanting to see more diversity in our churches and doing whatever it takes within biblical reason to do so. Yeah. The beautiful thing is that we have the biblical instruction to move forward without compromising our Christian belief. We have a way forward. We have the truths that are there, and we're not even doing that much. Because I have a lot of social reforms that I think could help, a lot of practical things that I think would help Mennonites disciple better, and I've written about those. Yeah. But what's really most important is what do we already have here in the scriptures? Yeah. What is already here? What's been here for the last 2,000 years that we can tap into and we can learn from? And that's what I'm mostly passionate about, because that's what's infallible. That's what is evident. Yeah. And it's very evident that the book of Romans was meant to indicate Jews and Gentiles, especially talking to the Jews at the moment, saying we even went as far to say that the Jews were used, their failures were used to reach the Gentiles, which is like a big slap in the face to any racist or ethnocentrist of that time. Like, you guys, God's chosen people, did so poorly that God started using your failures to reach the Gentiles. Yeah. Think Jonah. Just the purpose being, let's take joy when other cultures find Christ. And let's not shame them to that. Let's love them to that. And then let's let the church become better because of it. And I think that that's ultimately what happens when we we reach cultures and we um, pursue them, as you said.
Yeah.
We find more beautiful things.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about nature. We'll talk about how beautiful nature is and going out and exploring nature. 80-year-olds going out and discovering new things about nature and how awesome that is. But people are, that's racist. And to me, that is just such a perversion of scripture that it really bugs me that we'll put more effort into going out and understanding God's stones and God's trees and God's birds. But then here are people in front of us in his image. And we'll use excuses like, well, that'd be racist to go and ask them their perspective on things. And if this helps, you don't have to mention their color. You can just have pure intentions. You can just demonstrate through your life, and this is probably better. You don't have to go up and say, someone came up to me one time, they wanted to diversify their baby's experience. So he came up to me and said, "Would you hold my baby as a black man so she's not afraid of black people?" I'm not going to tell you how that made me feel. You could probably infer. It would have been better for him just to give me the baby, right? And he knows why. He has good intentions. He's a loving guy.
Was he a friend?
I know one person. Huh?
Was he a friend of yours that, like, you interacted
Hardly.
with often? Oh, okay.
Hardly. We had spent time at we spent time together for, I won't say where, but anyway, we had spent a few weeks before together in the same area. And someone asked me, so what more would you rather have him do? There's someone attempting to appreciate you and it hurt your feelings. How are we supposed to do this? And I said, well, it would have helped if it wasn't just about my color. It would have helped if it was, here you are, a human being that can love my daughter. Would you please do that by holding her? Absolutely. We're part of the same kingdom. Like, I would love to help shepherd your child into becoming a loving person. And I don't mind knowing that because I have the color that I do, it's helpful if I love them. It's helpful that, and I've had people in our church that kind of like cautiously come up to me and say, "Hey, is it okay if I like the fact that you as a person of color are loving my children?" I'm like, well, yeah. I mean, isn't that a part of who I am? Isn't that a part of what I bring to the table here? And again, not everybody feels that way because there's a lot of bitternesses, there's a lot of frustrations, and those things they all count, they all matter. At the end of the day, the kingdom should be seen in such a way that everybody, including skin colors, everything, there's so much about everyone that can be brought in to help the larger family. And one thing I actually say in my article that I just posted is, and I'm not self-promoting, I'm just referencing the article which article? Is I talked a little bit earlier about my perspective as a biracial Mennonite man. That in itself is, dare I say, a gift. It is something that I can bring to help others. I am a more effective teacher because I look like the people I'm serving. I connect so much easier, and also experiences. I mean, I grew up in the same place I'm teaching. No one else except our administrator can say that about our school that's working there right now, and my sister. That is unique to me and my family. And that matters. That makes a big difference in not the negative aspects, not you don't have this and I do. This is a gift. This is worth celebrating. This is something that we can use to better reach people and love them. And that's awesome, not bad. That's not negative. That's not wrong. And I think we've been given the impression over years that diversity is something that threatens us and that potentially could even be a bad thing. And that's not, when you read through the book of Romans, that's not what is said. We don't have to kill off everything that they know and that they appreciate. We can help them bring to the table what is useful, what is not. I don't know if that means that we listen to, I love African tribal music. I love it. I love it. I love it. Ever since I got into it, I've listened to it almost every day.
Mm-hmm.
I love Taizé music from France and
Mm-hmm.
all these different cultures. I love them. And I think that just because someone else doesn't love them doesn't mean that they're racist, doesn't mean that they're
Mm-hmm.
prejudiced. But if someone joins their church and does love it, um, and what I see as valid forms of worship, you don't have to start playing it in your house, but at least listening to why they like it.
Yeah.
And sometimes a simple "well, thanks for sharing" is enough. That's a classic Clayton line.
Yeah.
Is when he doesn't really know how to respond, doesn't maybe even see the point in what they're saying. And you can say this to me without and yeah, there's always going to be someone who is a little more a little offended that well, you don't like my music, and that means you don't like me. Those are immaturities. Those are not. I can't defend those. Those are.
Yeah.
That's not true. I don't have to like your music to like you. But if you like it, maybe I'll try it, or at least I'll listen to you and why you're passionate about
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
We can at least go that far,
Yeah.
and that you can't do that with the mindset that you had mentioned before,
Yeah.
where it's racist to call this to even ask and seek out this wisdom. This is why it's important for us to seek out these cultures because we can learn so much. And by learning, we are also loving them. We are also making sure they feel appreciated.
Yeah.
And that's how we should be treating each other in the
Yeah.
church.
Yeah.
We can
Yeah.
begin treating them, I'll stop here. We can begin treating them like brothers before they even are brothers. It's one of the principles that I share in my discipleship articles
Yeah.
is you should begin valuing them as a part of your family
Yeah.
before they even are there. And if you do that, then once they take on Christ, they're already ingrained. They're already relating to you on a personal level. You can have those things.
Yeah.
So even if you encounter a person of color that isn't a Christian, the practice of valuing them this way
Yeah.
is a good practice.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. It it seems like a lot of it, we are told to do unto others what we would have them do to us. And if you flip it and think like I enjoy talking about my culture, I enjoy talking about my things that I like, things that traditions, even like my family as opposed to another white family or whatever. We all enjoy talking about those nuances of our upbringing, of our preferences and so forth. And so to ask somebody about theirs not only allows them to talk about something they enjoy talking about, but then we get to know them better at a deeper level and can see into their likes and dislikes and so forth. But then on the flip side, if I stop and think about how weird it would be for somebody to bring their baby up to me and be like, "Hey, you're white. Can you hold my baby?"
Mm-hmm.
Like that would just feel weird.
Or I want a Mennonite to hold my baby. Can you hold
Yeah,
my baby?
yeah.
Yeah.
Like it's gonna feel weird to a black or brown person too. It's not. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, yeah. No, that's good. I think too, like kind of with that, learning someone's taste and culture. You have mentioned in this episode you have referenced passages from scripture that demonstrate the diversity that I haven't even thought about. Like I think of other passages. I hadn't thought about John looking and seeing many different tribes and tongues. Like I just read that and yeah, that's true. But to think about the fact that he saw with his eyes different colors, different tribes, I don't think about that. And probably because I very rarely walk into a group of people and think, "Oh, I'm the only white person here." Um,
Mm-hmm.
so I'm just saying all that to say that as we hear people's backgrounds, as we stories, their different tastes and so forth, different verses that stick out. We get a different perspective, even of Scripture or of God, than we do just in and of ourselves. So if it's not racist to ask someone about their culture or how they feel around white people or whatever, what is racism? How do we define racism? And it seems like we probably should have started the episode with this question, because my experience has been when there is controversy in these conversations, a lot of it comes back to that two people are approaching their understanding of racism, the definition of that word, that term, differently. Some people see racism as just the fact that you would take another person of a different ethnicity or any particular race and make them your slave. A very graphic. You're not paying them. You're abusing them. They're working for you. You're sitting in plush.
Mm-hmm.
Other people, like myself, I would understand racism to be more an embedded prejudice that maybe isn't graphic or always visible, and not even always hostile, but just kind of a way of thinking and observing the world that causes me to neglect other races potentially. How would you define racism?
Yeah, so let's start at the base. Racism at a base is the uplifting or degrading of another race in relation to another. Mm-hmm. So it's racist of me to say black people are better than white people, period. That's a racist thing to say. Or vice versa, that white people are less than black people, or yeah. The pushback that definition has been given in the last 15, 20 years, and what has become a more popular definition among academics, is that racism is prejudice, which is basically another word for ignorance. Prejudice is when you are unaware of something, and so you treat something or say something that's not right because you lack wisdom, you lack knowledge. That's what prejudice is. And so saying that black people should, if you bring up the issue of employment, the discrepancies between employment opportunities, and I've had people tell me before, black people don't deserve the same opportunities because the crime rates are higher. Well, the crime rates are higher, but it's prejudicial because, first off, I'm not a criminal. Mm-hmm. And so, therefore, I deserve the same opportunities. Mm-hmm. And it's also racist because you're saying that because I look like this, I deserve worse treatment. Mm-hmm. There are prejudices that are not racism. I don't like cottage cheese. I've never had cottage cheese before. It looks nasty. It smells nasty. It sounds nasty. I don't like it. I'm prejudiced towards it, and it doesn't appeal to me. That's an innocent example. There are prejudices in my life that are human to human, and they're not good. We all have those prejudices, and I think when people say we're all racist, I far more prefer to say that we all have prejudices because we are all ignorant. And anybody can agree with that we all lack wisdom. We all are constantly learning and constantly forgetting things we've learned. We will always have these prejudices. But I like to consider racism a sin that needs the blood of Jesus. And I don't want to have any definition that clouds that messes that up. So the idea that racism is prejudice plus power is a newer definition, is a newer, it even implies that if you don't have power, if you don't have institutional power or an arm of authority, you can't be racist. which I find hard to navigate through, because growing up where I did, I knew racist black people. And if what they were saying wasn't racist, then what is it? Is it really prejudice? They know very well what they're saying is ignorant, but they're and it's definitely elevating one race above another or degrading one below another. But we can't call it racism because they're not white. They're not in a position of institutional power. I believe that racism can be true on several levels. It can be true from poor to poor. It can be true from poor to rich. It can be true from white to black, black to white. And I believe that it differs in appearance and in severity based off of the level it's on, how it's being portrayed. If it involves money and livelihood, that's a different type or a different struggle with racism than it is if it involves the Mennonite Church, or it involves adopting a black child into your family and not treating him right. It appears differently. It brings on different monsters. And I think that's how sin is in general. Robbing from a corner store will get you into different trouble than robbing a bank does. And I think that that's how the natural world around us, the order that God set, has existed since the beginning of time. You write about pornography quite a bit. I approached one of my professors one time and I asked him, is it wrong? So we're supposed to confess to each other when we're wrong, right? We're supposed to confess. When we have wronged someone personally, we're supposed to confess. He had just preached a sermon about it on a Sunday. And then I asked him, I was like, so if I lust after a woman, should I go confess to her that that's what I did? I knew his answer. Of course not. I mean, there's no way he'd say yes, right? And that's where he introduced me to the idea that sometimes we have to include what we know about the natural order of the world, the way God works through that, to know and have wisdom and have tact and knowing. And he actually told me, Keeshon, if your heart is telling you to do that, then go do it. And he knew it wasn't. But we know that would be inappropriate. We also know that if we stole from someone, we should confess that and we should restore it. It's both scripturally true and it's consciously true, that if I wrong you, you should know about it. So with racism, there are levels. I think my point is not that the severities matter. Racism is racism. It's sin, it's sin, it's sin. And if it's sin, it needs the blood. And so I think it's all wrong. I think it's all bad. But I think that there are different ways it expresses itself. And it's all racism. But it needs to include prejudice put into racist actions. It needs to include an elevation or a degrading of another race.
Yeah.
Even if it's just one person representing that race. Yeah. I'm not a fan of anything that it absolves someone because of the way they look or the position they're in, that they can't sin because they don't have power. Yeah. Does a thief steal if he steals from the powerful? Does a thief steal if he's a homeless man? I think that racism needs to be capable of all of us. But that the implication is that there may even be levels. I'm not completely comfortable writing about that. And again, this is an exploratory perspective because I've been really considering this racism plus power definition quite a bit. Ever since I wrote my article about it a while back, 3 years ago or so, I've really been considering the implications of that. So this is exploratory. Yeah. But that there may be levels of it, all wrong, all needing the blood of Christ. And there may also be there are levels of it that appear differently depending on how it's coming through.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting hearing you talk about it because you're one of the first people of color that I've talked to who doesn't isn't comfortable with that definition, prejudice plus power, and so I've really kind of listened to that definition more because it seemed like one that was surfacing quite a bit. But then to hear you talk brings another perspective, and I get what you're coming at. Basically, correct me if I'm wrong, but what I'm hearing you is prejudice plus power at its surface sounds like it absolves anybody who doesn't have power from having to deal with that sin of racism. And also what I'm hearing you talk about is that there's different levels of, so like someone might, here in LA, I have personally bumped into the fact that as a white person I can charge people more for I do handyman work. I can charge people more, and people don't really bat an eye about it, than what some, like the Mexicans are all. That's cheap labor. That's, if they were to charge, even if they might do as good a job as me,
Mm-hmm.
people view them as the cheap labor if you want to go the cheap route.
Interesting.
And
yeah.
So someone might be able to say, well, I don't do that. I understand, this Mexican brother might do just as good a job, and so I'll pay him what he's worth. But then maybe in the church would have a little harder time following him as a pastor than another white person. So
Yeah.
like at the service level, as far as work and vocation and stuff, he's not racist. But when it comes to interactions in the church and the brotherhood and choosing leaders and so forth, he might be racist. As opposed to
Mm-hmm.
another white guy who really hasn't demonstrated a whole lot of the fruit of the Spirit and the transformation of Jesus Christ, but he's been in the church all his life, and so we kind
Yeah.
of, and so I see what you're talking about too with the different levels of racism. I guess one of the questions that I have, I'd love to hear your response. So you mentioned the different kinds of prejudice that we can have, which is also true, and so now I'm rethinking my thought. I would have viewed prejudice. So yes, anybody can be prejudiced, and that's in itself a sin. A prejudice towards another human being made in the image of God is. Are you still with me? Shoot, you with me, Keeshon? Hey, you there?
Oh, you're back.
Okay.
I heard you got to I would have seen prejudice as, and then it
Oh,
it
okay.
stopped.
Okay. Yeah. Um, yeah, I would have seen prejudice as a sin that we all need. Prejudice to another human being made in the image of God as being a sin that we all need to deal with. And then racism as being this larger picture as a result of this sin. Because part of what I like about the racism plus or prejudice plus power definition is that if we define racism just as prejudice, the response that I often hear is, well, everybody's prejudiced, and we just get deflection as opposed to actually dealing with the issue of power. Like it seems there needs, in order to talk about racism, um, at the societal level, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
You some eventually you it seems like you also have to have a conversation about power and the way that, I don't know. I think it's Jamar Tisby. He wrote the book Color of Compromise. Talks about racism being the culture of racism here in America. It's like a moving sidewalk. So if you're not racist, you're not participating in it, but you're not standing up against it or fighting against racism, doesn't mean that you're helping anything. You're just going along with culture down the sidewalk. And you have to actually stand up and start walking against the stream and fighting against racism if you're going to change anything from that
Absolutely.
embedded. And so he brings out a lot of the power aspect of just, so if we think of power as enslaving people, then it's like, well, no, that doesn't exist today. But if we think of power as in who are the ones giving voice, who are the ones making decisions, and is there anybody who's black or anybody who's a black single mom living off of welfare here in LA, like, is her voice being heard in our church or in our city council or whatever, for the decisions that are made for the church body or for the local community or whatever level of governance we're talking about? In a way, that can be another aspect of, oh man, are you with me? Are you there?
So could you hear me when that happened?
No, you were just quiet. Did you
Yeah,
hear
I
me?
couldn't hear you either.
Yeah. Oh, this is.
No, it cut off.
Where did I cut off?
Oh, about are they being heard? The council and
Yeah.
stuff like that.
Yeah. So, how do you include that aspect of it too? I guess is what I'm saying. The fact that
Yeah.
power gives you the
Well, it's
ability.
interesting.
Yeah. Go for it.
It's interesting. You said that you would have saw prejudice as sin, and then racism as a effect, and I would have seen a little differently, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I guess my response would be what you're explaining is a form of racism,
Mm-hmm.
and prejudice. I just feel like maybe you could call it the leap theory, that you take a leap to racism when it involves a clear sign that this person is being undervalued because of their color, or because of not just color, even their categorization as a part of Black culture.
Mm-hmm.
That's also important to recognize that it's not always about their color. Some of it's about the way their name sounds, the way they're. So I acknowledge that needs to be addressed in a aggressive and clear way. I feel that it is another type of racism, institutional racism, or what are good terminologies for racism in the workplace. Maybe that's just what it is, workplace racism. I think that those are all types of racism. I think it's possible for people to be undervalued and it not be their color, not be their culture. I don't know if I'd call it racism, and that's where I feel like you have to have somewhere where a leap is taken, and I don't think power should be the judge of that, because especially in poor communities where white people are not involved. In York, yes, we have white government, but there are also other places where the neighborhoods are predominantly Black and the mayor is Black, and the business owners are mostly Black. And so does racism exist in those counties, in those neighborhoods, or is it just all prejudice? And I really especially don't like what usually is a logical conclusion of all this, and that minorities cannot be racist. The idea that they cannot make the leap into sin there. And so you redefining that the prejudices could be sinful is interesting. I don't have enough time here to think through that, but that's I think, a worthy response that needs to be considered. Is it possible that maybe the prejudices are sinful? Um, but you would also agree, though, that racism is sinful, wouldn't you?
Oh yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. In that the sin of prejudice is clearly leading to racism.
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah. I don't like I told when I listen to you talk, and there's been other people I've had conversations about the prejudice plus power. I totally get the concern that it kind of seems to absolve those without power of having that sinful attitude. I guess my question is what keeps people from just deflecting, and maybe we just need to aggressively address the issue of deflection um,
Mm-hmm.
when when we just say, well, everybody's racist, like, or everybody's prejudiced, everybody has, and it,
Well,
like, I guess the prejudice plus power doesn't address the potential for someone in power. No, sorry, I'm getting this wrong. Yeah, I'm not sure where my mind was going there, but um, yeah, go for it. What were you gonna say?
so one thing that I've heard before, I disagree with, um, and actually, you said I'm the first person of color that you've heard with this perspective. I don't have friends of color that agree with me on this that I've talked to about. I haven't talked about this specific issue with all of them. So I
Mm,
admit that I'm a stubborn man. If I don't see evidence for it, I don't accept it. So, um, but I have talked about it a lot, and so it's a pretty. I think I still believe it.
mm,
But with that being said, um, I'm a part of a group of social studies teachers that get together at conferences and have circles and communicate. And one of the things that's very common is when break talking about the issues of slavery and manifest destiny and all these things and the Holocaust. We have to teach our students that if they were in the shoes of a Nazi, they would have listened to what Hitler said too.
mm, mm,
I pushed back on this because there were people who were not
mm,
listening to Hitler.
mm,
There were white people who were not slave owners and were against it.
mm,
And so to suggest that you're not responsible for what you do because you're conditioned is a very that's what's probably causing that reaction to
mm,
this idea that there can be people who can't be termed as racist. It really it comes from a mindset that's similar to that um, feels like it allows us to take away
mm,
a shared human experience. We're all capable of evil,
mm,
and we're all capable of thieving. We're all capable of lying. We're all capable of adultery or fornication, but we don't do them
yeah,
because we're Christians.
yeah,
And I feel like, um, but then again, yeah, most history teachers in the circle that I'm in would disagree with me about the whole history thing. They would still hold that we should teach students that, and I agree that we should teach them that they shouldn't cynically judge
mm, mm,
all people in history because they were all bad people, because we're bad people too. Like we have the abortion thing happening right now, and
mm,
it's possible that 10 years from now people will look down on us very severely for what's going on right now.
mm,
Um, we're
mm,
not being vocal enough. We're not being active enough. We're not doing enough there.
mm,
And so, but I don't think that means that there couldn't have been Nazis. Of
yeah,
course there could have been a Nazis did not have to be Nazis,
yeah,
and
yeah,
um, racists do not have to be racist. And
yeah,
um, so my definition, I want it to be something that allows for all people to fall in or walk away from
yeah,
evils.
yeah,
And sometimes I think the weakness of the racism plus power definition is if you are a white, powerful male in America, you are inherently racist.
mm, mm,
if you are a poor black person in America, you are inherently not racist.
Hmm. So yeah,
That's racist.
yeah,
That in itself is
yeah,
fundamentally racist,
yeah,
and I don't at all. I can't tell you that I don't think about um,
yeah,
powerful white people as a threat to poor black people. That's a real part of my experience.
yeah,
I think we need more black business owners. I think we need all of that. And
yeah,
I'm sure that if I could talk to your aunt, to others of color who have um, subscribed to this definition, to others who would like this definition more, that we would agree with almost everything that needs to be happening for
hmm,
black people.
hmm,
But I do disagree fundamentally with this idea that, um,
yeah.
yeah,
That
what I
that
so.
you need power, yeah. And
Mhm.
I like too the so obviously prejudice plus power seems to absolve those who aren't powerful, but also you've brought out how our definition of racism needs to be something that we can leave, just like you're saying, a white powerful man can leave and not be racist and still be in a position of power and authority and so forth.
By love and by the blood.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
the Chris. We have to remember that Christian life is this solution. Like that's something that I think that we're kind of ashamed of.
yeah,
We always have to go back to Jesus, and I'm like, what else are we gonna do? Well, that's the author and finisher of our faith. Like
yeah.
that's what we believe in. That's what we put stock in.
Mm-hmm.
And so you talked about people saying we're all racist. So that's how I combat it. I say, well, we weren't all Nazis either. We weren't all slave owners. We
Yeah,
don't all have to be sinfully racist.
yeah,
And we address that through two things: love and the blood of Jesus. We have
yeah,
to get rid of the sin. We have to confess this. We have to surrender this.
yeah,
And then we have to rely on the Holy Spirit to get power
yeah,
to overcome, Jesus to give the blood,
yeah,
um,
yeah,
and the Father to have mercy. We that's what we need,
yeah, yeah.
in my
Amen.
opinion.
Amen. Hey, I've really enjoyed this. We've been talking for a couple hours now. Um, so I should let you go. And I would love, do you have any advice for people who have adopted children of color? Um, obviously, if they're not that same color, and what this is a conversation we my wife and I have talked about adopting over the years. Right now, we're kind of um, scared to we feel the overwhelm of our own kids, let alone we don't want to damage other kids. Um, that's kind of a weak response, I guess, because there are so many kids without families who needs families, and it's something that is on our hearts. And so, even in our imperfectness, to be a part of providing that family and shepherding them to the Father in family. But one of the things that I've often thought about is the cultural differences. I've observed closely the challenge of adoption. Period. But then you add on to that cultural differences and racial differences. And there's, I forget where it was, somewhere recently I saw a comment from someone who was an adoptive parents, and basically they were hearing questions and conversations from their children who were colored. I'm not sure if they specified which. And they were troubled by it, and then finally they just had to talk with them about how it's, you know, everyone is, you know, there's no difference, no color. Um, and I like obviously it's just a comment on a Facebook thread, and so there's probably a lot being misunderstood from me as I read that. But I wince a little bit because I wonder. It seems like when we as whites go to adopt, especially in conservative Anabaptist world, it's so important that we understand that we give those kids the space to wrestle with questions of racism, to wrestle through the difficult story of the back of their people and the history,
Mm-hmm.
um, and that we acknowledge our people's part in sinning against them, or rather than just trying to quickly kind of salve that part of. Just curious what your any advice you would have for adoptive parents, or um, yeah.
Yeah. Two experiences I have. One is a family that goes to our church that adopted a little biracial girl, beautiful young girl. Um, and the mom actually came and asked me, what do I do?" Literally, that was what she asked. Like, how do I help her grow up, seeing her skin as a beautiful thing, and not adopting prejudicial outlooks that Mennonites may have, that would end up causing self-identity issues and serious confusion for her as she grows up. The other experience I have is having been adopted into the Shank family, and the struggle that has been. Yeah, to me, a lot of what you said hits on it. Most of the major things. I think, though, as they're being taught, I hesitate to say, even though I think it's important, that they should be um, extra intentional about pursuing people of color, befriending people of color, because it sounds like if I say that, then I'm saying you should befriend people of color for your benefit, not a way of service, not a way of love. And I want it to always be about service and love. We have to somehow make sure that this young person, of color or not color, but especially of color, purposes to serve all, becomes a servant of all, and loves all. And we should not allow a negative perspective of their self or their people get in the way of that. And I've seen that happen. I talked about it earlier. I've seen it happen where they grow up and they hear all these strong opinions, and then they just go with the one that's most accessible, because to stand out and speak against that would be a social suicide in many ways. They're surrounded in a youth group, the people who would not agree with them, and so they just take on the worldview most readily ahead there with them. Yeah. Then they get into their late teens and adult years, and they're really, really confused because I think we combat that first with a scriptural view of race. We not just that we're just all humans, but that we are all gifted in different ways. Again, that when John looked up into the heavens, he saw colors, and he noticed that and mentioned that there were different tribes up there. Why would he say that? Why does that matter? It's not racist for John to say there were tribes. That's not racist. And so, or prejudicial. It's neither of them. And so, for that kid to grow up, or if they're adopted as teenagers, to learn that we as a family, we as a church, a local church, can't speak for the whole church, but as a local church, are learning alongside you. We are also learning because we're not very adequate ourselves as white Mennonites who probably have not had a lot of exposure ourselves. Let's spend the next 20 years learning this together. It takes a ton of tact. It takes a lot of forgiveness from both ends, because there will be mistakes when you're that close, when you're that involved. People can ally with me and jump in and out, and we never ever we never get in massive fallouts because we're not close enough to do so.
Yeah.
That was different when I
I'll be right back.
Go ahead. This reminds me of Kevin's kids.
Yeah.
What was I saying? Yeah.
Something was different. You were just about ready to say it was
Yeah, I
different.
know. And I forget what I was going to say was um yeah, I lost that.
Yeah.
Um yeah, we for young adopted people of color, recognizing that maybe you're not equipped to provide them with what is ideal.
Mm.
And so you're going to be learning a little bit ahead of them.
Mm.
And eventually they're going to be there. I mean, they know their experience better than you. So it's not that you're wiser or more aware of their experience than they are.
Mm.
But as parents, you need to be authoritative in some ways. And so demonstrate what it should look like. And that's why I said I hesitate to say that you should go befriend more people of color, but that's an example of something that is helpful. Is they have people of color coming into your home, and I say this is helpful for Mennonite kids too, to see people of color coming in and laughing with you, and no, we don't. They are human. And that sounds so strange to say because clearly we know they're human.
Yeah.
But some children are growing up not even knowing that much.
Yeah.
And I've had kids come up to me. I've even heard them ask their parents in Mennonite churches, "What is he? You know
Wow.
what are we looking at basically?"
Yeah.
This is more on the humorous side, but a kid came up to me one time from our church, mind you. Our church is pretty diverse when it comes to where people live and when they come in and how often they come into the city.
Mm-hmm.
So this kid knew nothing about people of color except for me. I was the one person of color, and a cousin I think he has. And so he came up to me. He's like, "Keeshon, you don't have any skin. Where's your skin?" And I'm like, "What are you talking about? It's right here. Look, feel the skin." He's like, "Oh, but it's brown. Like, it's okay. You don't have any skin. It's okay." Like,
wow.
assuring me that I was still accepted, even though I wasn't normal. And he probably still thought I was a human. But how do we get to these places? And how do we combat them?
Yeah.
And I don't want to say we should humanize Black people because they should already be human. They should already be that.
Yeah.
But for the sake of children, we need to make it clear to them that these are our friends in the same way that white people are our friends. Yeah. That's not saying the same thing as, I don't see color. Yeah. They see the color, and they always will. Yeah. It's saying that the color doesn't make them subhuman. It doesn't make them sub-Mennonite. It just means that, they're beautiful in a different way, and we need to learn to embrace that. So we need to teach them to embrace color. And however we do that, I mean, I'm sure parents of kids of color have better stories and better experiences than I do. Yeah. I think I would like to adopt as well. I think adoption is a serious weak spot for the church. I think we should be adopting far more. And if I were adopting a white kid, that would greatly change how I went about family devotions. How I went about, what documentaries you watch as a family, what books are in our home. I'd want to make sure that he understands that he's loved and accepted. We should at least be giving that much to the kids of color in these homes. And the church should be supporting, this is the last thing I want to say about it, the church should be supporting that family and helping in that regard. They should all join in accepting and learning from, eventually, that kid should be offering a perspective to that church in men's meetings when he's 18. Yeah. And that's something that is built over time. with your humility, love, acceptance, and some hard conversations.
Yeah. That's good. Well, thank you, Keeshon, for taking the time for 2.5 hours here and dealing with some technical difficulties. And I always enjoy talking with you. I always enjoy, as I said earlier, just the radiant, you radiate Jesus, and I can see your love for him, and I'm blessed and challenged by that. If you, anybody listening, if you want to continue to follow Keeshon's work, it's urbanitemusings.wordpress.com. Is that correct? I'll drop a link in the episode notes as well, but definitely go check out. He's running a series on racism, what the Mennonite Church has got wrong about racism right now. But you mentioned before, I think this was before we started, you mentioned this series has gotten the most views, and it's really good. But one of my favorite series of yours is the one you did on discipleship, inner city discipleship. Definitely go check that out as well. It's a really good series just on practical perspectives of discipling people and why sometimes our efforts to disciple in the inner cities don't work out as we intend. But anyways, thank you for coming on again, and look forward to having more conversations and one of these days meet face to face.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. We'll talk to you later. God bless.